Welcome to the Enterprise GTM podcast, hosted by Tim Zonka and Vidya Raman. Each episode takes a deep dive into how to successfully maneuver the unique dynamics of enterprise go-to-market while candidly discussing successful approaches, pitfalls, and failures alike. Our guests are seasoned company founders, GTM execs, technology buyers, and end users. Please note that the views expressed by individuals in these podcasts are not to be treated as investment advice. They are also not representing the views of their employers, current or previous.
Welcome. So today we're talking about all things open source with someone we consider the leading wealth of knowledge and insights around all things open source, Emily Omier. Emily helps founders of open source startups accelerate revenue growth. She helps founders figure out the best revenue model, given their open source project's audience, competitive landscape, relative strengths, weaknesses. She's a regular contributor to the New Stack and hosts The Business of Open Source, a podcast about building a successful open source company. As a quick reminder, our podcast aims to address the go-to-market needs of early-stage startup founders. So in this conversation, we'll use that specific lens as Emily helps unpack what she's seeing today and in the emerging horizon. Welcome, Emily. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
So I'd love to start with a really simple question. What is an open source company?
I'm really glad you asked, Tim, because I think too often when we talk about open source companies, we don't first define what exactly an open source company is. So to me, an open source company, first of all, has a very tight relationship with an open source project. And by an open source project, I mean a project that has an OSI approved license. And any OSI approved license is an open source project, right? But if it's not OSI approved, it's not. The next part is that the company has to have a really fundamentally important relationship with that project. So if that project were to go away, it would fundamentally change that company's identity. And so, for example, sometimes there's a company that will have a commercial product and then they'll have like an SDK or something like that that's open source. That's not really an open source company. It has to be something that's like really core to that company's products and that company's identity. And then, this is going to be obvious, it has to be a company, right? It has to be a company that has a profit motive, that offers a commercial product or services. And one thing that I sometimes talk about is if you're starting an open source company, you have to ask yourself, like, am I committed to building a company that makes a profit, that pays people, that has revenue? Because sometimes that can also be an issue in the open source world.
And do you see, like, what's your guidance to founders or, executives of companies that don't necessarily start as an open source, but, I say like, hey, should we open source that thing? And there's this, I think to your point, it's like, it's not part of maybe the foundation or the DNA initially.
So you can become an open source company from like a closed source company can definitely become an open source company. And in fact, I think one of the things we're going to talk about is sort of trends that I'm seeing. And this is a trend that I see. I see a lot of companies, founders, leaders deciding that they're going to take what had once been fully proprietary source code and open source, often not all of it, but a huge portion of it. So create an open source project out of that source code. So let me actually first talk about what I think is the sort of fundamental challenge for open source companies. And then I'll get back to this answer. The fundamental challenge for an open source company, this sort of goes into the definition of what is an open source company. You have a project that delivers value in and of itself. So again, if you have an open source project that is not usable, that does not provide value without your commercial product, I don't think you're really an open source company. And then the second part is that you have to provide commercial offerings of some kind. It can be services in order for you to fit into my definition. There's plenty of services companies out there that are open source companies, but you have to have a commercial offering that offers additional value and that people are willing to pay for. So basically, both your project and your commercial offering has to deliver value. So if you are the leader of a company that is completely closed source, first step, think about that sort of fundamental challenge. How can I cut up my source code so that there is a piece that's going to provide real value to users without them ever having to have a relationship with our company, but still reserve something that we can sell? And I'm really careful not to just say product, again, because there's a lot of open source companies. We can get into, is it venture backable? Is it what's more profitable? Blah, blah, blah. But there's definitely open source companies that are service based. And I think that's a legitimate way to make money as an open source company. But still, whether it's services or product, you still have to be able to deliver some sort of commercial offering to customers that they're going to get additional value from that they're willing to pay for.
You just mentioned venture-backed, monetization or commercialization. And so it's 2024. And so unless it's AI specific, the world of early stage B2B startups hasn't been exactly rosy. Whereas just 2 years ago, you got capital's abundant. It was readily available for, any open source software organization with, a few thousand stars and maybe even zero revenue. But times have changed, to say the least. So tell us, what are you seeing in the market for open source software?
So what I would say is happening for open source companies is probably the same as what's happening for non-open source companies, is that you have to have hard revenue numbers sooner. And I think what's different is that, like you alluded to, it used to be you just had an awesome project and this was enough to get some investment. And I think what's happening now is that investors are really looking for some sort of assurance that you have not just a project that's awesome, but you have a monetization plan that's going to actually work. Because I think both founders, I also think even to a larger extent, a lot of investors got sort of seduced into the idea that any open source project that had a huge amount of traction was going to automatically turn into a really profitable company. And I think that this is also really key when thinking about open source companies. You have project market fit, and then you have product market fit. And having one does not mean that you have the other. And this is where a lot of companies really struggle because they expect, in my opinion, actually, I think there's a psychological aspect to this, quite frankly. If you go into it expecting that you're going to convert X% of your open source users into paid customers, and then that doesn't happen, you're like, oh my God, what do I do next? Whereas if you go into it with the understanding that you almost have to start from scratch, you really have to interrogate your user base and interrogate your potential customers so that you can build the functionality that delivers the value that customers are willing to pay for, instead of thinking, okay, I'm going to throw something out there. We're going to get whatever % that you think it's going to be. It's because it's not a linear relationship with your community growth and your customer base.
I've never heard that differentiation between project market fit and product market fit, but that's a really powerful insight. I'm curious to, after this, spend some time thinking like, how much does a project market fit even compare, or are there similarities to like almost like a freemium for a commercial organization, market fit? Like it's serving such a different purpose that looks up on the edges like it's the same. So I love that delineation. What about, can you go into some detail on the open source software for technical users in particular? So, examples like databases or dev tools, so on. For early stage startup founders, open sourcing, part, if not all, their offering, it seems like it's a quick way to get market feedback, build awareness, get trust of a large audience. But you've alluded to this already a couple of times. At the same time, we see these open source software companies struggle with the monetization, or someone copies some or all of their offering. And so given this conundrum, what do you suggest to an early stage, kind of like infra or dev tool founder, especially if they're just starting out? How do you help them think through, should they consider open source? How should they tackle that?
So first of all, I'm going to be like a real consultant and I'm going to say it depends. So I actually think that one of the mistakes that happens in the open source business world is thinking that there's a one size fits all solution. And one of the reasons I think that's particularly a mistake in talking about open source businesses is because open source businesses are actually quite diverse. So let's say we're talking about SaaS businesses, right? A SaaS business, sort of by definition, they all have the same monetization model. They all have the same, like many of the same technical difficulties. They're all asking you to swipe a credit card. They're usually all paying, you're paying either monthly or yearly, et cetera. But there's open source businesses that are SaaS, that are monetizing by SaaS. There's open source businesses that have like a traditional enterprise software sales cycle. There's open source businesses that have more of a price packaging and managed services model. There's support-based open source businesses. So the point is, it can be actually hard to generalize a lot of these things. So what I would tell founders is that the first thing that you have to think about is, what's your primary business goal from being an open source company? And there are different things that you can get out of being out of having your open source project, but it's not one size fits all, but it's also not like an unlimited options, right? It's more like you have a menu of business values that you could get, but you can't order everything on the menu. You want to order like one or two things. So if you think the reason that for this particular product idea or project idea, the reason that we're going to start with an open source project is because we want to get really fast adoption, for example. Okay, that's good to know. So then you can evaluate, are we in fact getting really fast adoption, getting wider adoption because of this open source project? If yes, good, it's working. If no, what do we need to do to change it? On the other hand, what if the main reason that we want to have this open source project is to get feedback? So adoption does not equal feedback. You can have 1 million people using your project and nobody ever telling you about it. That's not super likely, but it's just to outline that these are not the same business goals. And there's going to be projects that have a higher percentage of the users who are actually interacting with the maintenance team versus, others. So if your goal is to get really good feedback, then obviously you want to optimize for having a lot of interaction with your community and getting that feedback. And again, that's how you evaluate. Are we getting the feedback that we expected? Is it useful feedback? If yes, good. What are we doing that's working? If no, what are we doing that's not working? How do we change it? Because you want to be able to iterate, based on those goals that you want to get out of your open source project, you have to be able to iterate towards it. I think one of the other unique things about open source businesses is that you can have these KPIs that are not financial. And in fact, I think you have more non-financial KPIs than in a regular company. So if you just have a straight commercial company, it's like, all right, how much was our revenue? How much was our expenses? Okay, let's make our revenue numbers go up. Really simple, right? Our revenue went up. Great, we're killing it. But when you have an open source company, particularly when you're looking at your open source metrics, you have to know what KPI matters to you. And just because some other company is measuring, some KPI doesn't necessarily mean that that's the right thing for you to be measuring. So you have to really interrogate that. Yeah. So I guess that's the first thing I would say to an early stage founder who's considering going the open source route.
Emily, there are obviously lots of nuances here, and you touched upon some of these beautifully. You also talked a little bit about business models for open source companies. So just to, double click on some of that, we've obviously, like you said, come a long way since the Red Hat days. It's interesting to know you don't consider a company that is just offering support and services to be an open source company anymore.
Oh, no, I do.
Okay.
You can be a support-based company and have, I think the question that people ask themselves is a support-based company like a good venture, a good fit for venture funding? That's a fair question to ask, but totally. Absolutely, you're an open source company. I think that's a perfectly legitimate model.
Totally. Yeah. As a VC, I would say that yes, we see that a fair bit in the early stages, but there's always this ideally, in the end state or the, growth state, we want them to have transitioned more into a traditional product company. So anyway, in that continuum of businesses that have models around support, services, packaging, open core, you talked about managed or hosted or SaaS offering, all the way up to offering application level abstraction. There's a whole continuum of how sophisticated a company can get in terms of offering things which are open source plus plus, right? So in that particular scenario, you're thinking of like how some of these things can play out for an infra and dev tool startup. So scenario one is, let's say there's a young company and the risk of building too much is quite high, right? Because it's one thing to be able to offer just support and services, but then, if you want to go all the way out and build a SaaS product, that generally takes a lot more capital and risk if there isn't yet a lot of validation from customers to pay for something like that. So just wondering, could you share with us any good examples of approaches from early stage companies that address this? And by this, what I mean is that they're just starting out. They know that they eventually want to get to a SaaS product. When do they figure out what is the right time to do it? I've seen some companies start building it from the get-go. I've seen some companies wait until they see some real traction and build some support and services revenue. What have you seen work out from your experience?
So actually, why are you focusing on SaaS? Like, why not talk about the open core?
Fair point. I think, one can argue, I see open core as an extension of SaaS. Like open core is kind of SaaS in my view.
Mm. So actually, I don't see open core as SaaS. I see them as very different models. What I do see is people confusing the two in open source businesses.
Like I did. Yeah.
But I also think it's totally not your fault. But I think what happens is that the majority of open source businesses actually do both. And I'm not sure I want to say that this is a mistake because it works for companies. But I think the word that I would use is it is a challenge. And I think that people do not really appreciate to what extent it is a challenge. So the market for on-premise software of any kind is generally different from the market for SaaS. So if I'm the kind of person who needs to buy an on-prem, a software that I can run on-prem, chances are I am either working in a very large enterprise or I'm in the government sector, in the public sector. I have some pretty serious constraints around things like control over data, things like privacy, things like security. I have some expectations of what I'm going to get in the sales cycle that are absolutely not the same as if I am the kind of person who wants to buy a SaaS product. So I'm going to buy a SaaS product, whether this is, for my personal life or for my professional life. It's not actually terribly different. The expectations aren't terribly different for the buying process of a SaaS product, but the expectations of the buying process for an on-prem enterprise software, absolutely different. And so if you are an open source company and you're pursuing both of those things at the same time, you have two different product roadmaps because the on-prem software, yes, you can reuse some of your effort, but fundamentally, these are different products. They have different buyers. They have different users that exist inside different organizations. But just as importantly, your target market is different. So that means you have to have different sales skills inside your organization because one is going to expect to be able to have like a seamless sales experience where they swipe their credit card and boom, it's working. And one is going to expect to make you go through like a 9-month enterprise sales process with a POC, and they're going to be spending, 6 figures or more on the deal. And if they have a question, they want to be able to talk to a human and get it resolved. Right? So you have to have people in your organization that can make both of those sales motions, both of those go-to-market motions happen. This is really hard. And it adds a lot of complexity. We haven't even talked about the fact that if you're an open source company, right, you also have your open source project. And if you're going to get value out of your open source project, you have to be taking it seriously too. So as an early stage startup, if you're talking about doing both the enterprise on-prem software sales and the SaaS, you also have your project. You have 3 products. You have to manage 3 roadmaps. You have to have a sales team for your 2 things that you get money for. And those sales teams have to have completely different skill sets. And you have to think about like, how are you going to incentivize your sales teams in a way that makes sense for those 2 different products. Your marketing efforts has to target very different markets for each of your commercial offerings. And then, of course, there's a marketing aspect to building a community and getting people to use your open source project as well. And so you have basically 3 different audiences that you have to deal with. So you're adding a huge amount of complexity to your business. I do think as a first step, any open source company should pick one of the monetization models. So either do, just because you do SaaS first doesn't mean you can't later do an on-prem. Just because you do on-prem now doesn't mean you can't do SaaS later. But open source companies are already spreading themselves thinner than non-open source companies. So I think that one of the biggest risks to open source companies is taking on too much. This is also why, so I work with companies on positioning. This is also why I think positioning is extremely important because it is about focusing your team, focusing in on a small niche that you can really, really win and where you can really deliver the best value. I think it's even more important for open source companies because you have so many things that you have to juggle. You want to try to limit them and really make sure that you're focused so that you get the most out of your go-to-market efforts.
Those are some incredible points that you made, Emily. I think a lot of founders tend to underestimate what it actually takes to, first and foremost, sustain all these different efforts and then to also do it really, really well. I think it's definitely underestimated and underappreciated. So sounds like focus is key. And this also reminds me, there are some companies like, famous ones like Databricks, even though many of the key contributors in Spark are from Databricks, from the get-go, they were selling just their managed and basically their SaaS offering, as opposed to offering support and packaging around Spark. So I think there are some examples of companies that have, even though they may have 3 different products, as you pointed out, they decide early on to put their complete energy as it comes to like business model into one of those and do it really, really well. I think that's a great example.
It's also okay to make mistakes. So one of the things that I see a lot happen from companies is for them to say, we expected most of our customers would be the swipe your credit card type. And it turns out that most of our customers are the 9-month POC type. I mean, this is part of building a company. You make mistakes, you adjust. I think the thing that I would like to see founders avoid is, without that feedback, trying to take on both things at once. Do the one, then, build your SaaS offering because that's your hypothesis, is that you're going to mostly have the swipe your credit card types. And then if you get a bunch of market feedback that's like, no, we want this on-prem, we want our 12-month-long POC or whatever, based on that information, then build the second thing. But don't assume that you need to do both at the same time. I'm saying this because this happens all the time. The company starts with one hypothesis and then they move to another. That's fine. It's just you don't want to try to do too much.
I wonder, you've had experience working at open source companies, and I wonder if part of the reason why this happens, like this, spreading oneself so thin from the get-go, or, even when it doesn't make sense, I wonder if it mostly happens because there is this expectation coming both from the market and also from the leaders running the company that, the desired end state or the desired goal is to make most of the revenue from the swipe the credit card, the cloud offering. Although it is quite clear that there's a lot of value coming from that open source project, the traction, the community, and also the large contracts that often come from on-prem deployments. I wonder if it is that, the desire to not let go of any of those, and also the end state expectation, if you will. Could you comment about that based on your work experience?
And that was you had asked me that video?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'd love to get your take on this, Emily, because you've seen, I think you have just such a larger sample set to look across. But one of the things that I see is that as it relates to open source, there are a handful of things that I think leaders find extremely attractive about open source. And they tend to get that from the successful companies that everybody knows. And it's things like, large adoption, a thriving community of people, advocating on their behalf, and really espousing how awesome the technology or, even the community is. And I think also the assumption that there's a relatively easy flip of the switch from adoption and that advocacy to revenue. And that's where, like, Emily, your notion of project market versus product market fit, I really love. And I think it's, in my experience, there's actually you don't get the first part and then for free get the second part. There's a significant amount of work that has to happen to really connect those dots. And I think it's easy to overlook that, or maybe not have a strong appreciation for it. And especially even within, a leadership team where some people get it, more than others and appreciate that. And so I think that's I think part of it is people are like, oh, look, all we need to do is open source this thing and we'll build a community and then call it a day because it's just going to be flowing in. And I'm oversimplifying kind of the conversation, but I think it's easy to be lulled into that sense of success by doing something. I worked with a CMO who is fantastic at driving tangible adoption and translating it into dollars. And he's like, hey, it's easy to give stuff away for free. He's like, it's really hard to figure out how to monetize that. So, and that's, I guess, my, some of the things I've seen, either companies I've worked as part of or that I've worked with, from the outside. Emily, I'd love to hear how much that translates to, your larger set of companies that you've worked with.
I think that is 100% what I see. So I think what happens is that people forget that the fundamental characteristic of somebody who wants to use an open source project for free and somebody who wants to pay for a piece of software is very often different. There is often overlap. I would even say that not every open source company has any sometimes there's the Venn diagram could actually look like two circles. Usually it doesn't. Usually it looks like a Venn diagram. So there's some overlap of the community user characteristics and commercial user characteristics, but the target market is different. So the type of person who's going to use a free open source software is just often that they're using it often for personal use, or they're using it individually at work. Maybe they don't have really, really strict enterprise security requirements. And once you ask people to pay money, it also fundamentally changes the relationship between you and them. I mean, there's a psychological aspect here. So the difference between charging somebody $0 to use something and charging somebody 50 cents a month is, it seems like doesn't matter. That's not very much money, but psychologically it's a huge difference. In fact, it's much huger than the difference between charging somebody 50 cents a month and $10 a month. So you really have to think about what is the characteristic of somebody that is prepared to pay money, and what is the additional value? So this goes back to this question, right? What's the additional value that our commercial offering can deliver that somebody out there is willing to pay for? And I think what people can get really caught up on is they can deliver features in their commercial offering, but they don't always think about how is this feature delivering a value that's different, because people don't pay for features, they pay for value. So what does the user get out of this that is in addition to whatever you're getting from the open source project? And I think one of the things that people can also get caught up on is that sometimes what you'll see is that you'll actually get a different value. So your open source project will deliver a value that you won't get in the enterprise offering. So this could happen, for example, if one of the things that you get out of your open source project is that, for example, it's really fast to get started. People really appreciate that. But your enterprise customers, the thing that they value is having like a really tight compliance controls or really tight security. And the only way to do that is to make the onboarding process more annoying. Well, then there's actually going to be situations where if somebody really cares about ease of use, if ease of use or getting started fast is more important to them than security or compliance, you're going to tell them, look, our open source project is a better fit for you. So I think that's one of the things also to be aware of is that if you're running an open source company, you need to think about what are the situations where someone would actually be more happy with your open source project than with your commercial offering, because those situations exist. They exist for every company out there. And once you're aware of them, it also helps you overcome some of the psychological hurdles that I think exist for open source companies where they feel like their open source project is like cannibalizing their commercial offering. But once you're really clear on, okay, here's the situation in which our open source project is the best option, let's make sure everyone fits those criteria, just use our open source project and are super happy doing so. Whereas if they fit the criteria that we have for who's going to be really happy with our commercial offering, let's make sure we put them over there. And having that clarity first, helps you overcome that psychological burden, but it also makes you more valuable to your market, makes you gain credibility, because if you can talk to somebody or communicate with people and it doesn't sound just like, okay, everybody should pay us, but rather we are a guide. We have these two options. We want to help you choose the one that's best for your use case. You're going to gain so much credibility. And yes, those people who are open source, who are best off with open source now, they are going to really appreciate that you helped them understand that. They're going to talk about you. Maybe you're going to get the market share. Maybe they're going to go to a job that's going to be a better fit for your commercial offering next year or whatever, talk to their friend who's works at a place that's a good option for your commercial offering. So basically just being clear on the fact that the person who's a good fit for your commercial offering is not necessarily a good fit for your open source project and vice versa. And that's okay.
Even in that last bit, you kind of touch on this notion of the community effect or like the kind of the advocacy effect. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the things that I've seen that's super alluring to leaders in an organization, why we should do some open source. But I'd love to have you go deeper into some of that community building. Like you wrote a great blog on this and why people become part of communities in the first place. So help our founders understand more about that and how should they think about balancing that dichotomy or the tension of community and monetization?
So the first point that I want to make there is that you do not have to be an open source company in order to have a community. Mm-hmm. So when I think about companies that have done a really good job or that have a community around them, the first company that I think about actually is Harley Davidson. So like if you're a biker, you're going to join like a Harley group and go hang out and ride motorcycles. I don't know. I've never done it. But the point is like, that's a really good example of a community that exists around a brand. They're not an open source software. Closed source softwares can have communities around them. Commercial products can have communities around them. Community building is like by no means unique to open source companies. It's just that something that usually goes with open source companies. The parallel to that is actually as an open source company, you do not have to build a community. There are some open source companies that this goes back to the idea of why does it matter that you're open source? Sometimes the reason that companies want to go open source is because they have a market that's very paranoid. They want to be able to get their software through security reviews very quickly. It's relative, right? But quicker than otherwise. And having open source software that people can inspect helps them do that. And if that is the reason that open source matters to you, You don't need a community. I mean, who cares? That's not what your customers care about. That's not the business value that open source is bringing to your company. So now that I've got the sort of caveat around community building out of the way, I think the thing that's really important to think about community building before we talk about sort of like tactics is that people join communities because they want something out of it. And the thing that your community delivers should be something that is, again, above and beyond whatever somebody gets from just using your project anonymously without connecting with anybody else. And usually the things that you get out of community are psychological. Now, sometimes it's like you get support, you get your questions asked, but that's sort of the most, what I would call like the most basic level of community engagement. You go to a Slack or a Discord and you have a problem with the project, you ask a question and somebody answers it, and then you fix your problem. Now, what about that person who's answering the question? Now, in a lot of open source companies, the person answering the question is somebody that you're paying. So like, why are they answering the question? Well, because that's their job. But the goal for most open source projects or companies is to have people answer questions who are not getting paid by the company that's backing this project. And if you want that to happen, well, you have to think, okay, what's in it for them? Like, why would they want to take their time to answer like a troubleshooting question about our project? And based on whatever that answer is, you have to think about how to incentivize people to do that. And people, the reasons that this happens is like they want to help other people, they want to feel connected, they want to be a mentor. Sometimes it's a little more cynical than that. Like they want to increase their visibility in an ecosystem. They want to get a job, or they want to, improve their career. And one of the ways to do that is to be very visible in a community. The way to do that is to answer people's questions. So be aware of what people are coming to your community for, and make sure that you're tailoring whatever community building actions you're doing to those goals.
And what about, any just good, either strategies or even tactics that you recommend when people have some sort of established, community, even if it's a young one, to just foster a stronger one,
So to be completely honest, this is not my specialty. Here's a couple of things that I would say. Slack or Discord, I don't think it matters. A lot of tool questions are not super important. Choose the tool that you like. I don't think that your project is going to fail or succeed just because you chose one platform or the other. I think it's a lot more work than people anticipate. And I think that's certainly what I've seen, is that it is a massive amount of more work than people anticipate. However, having founders involved in directly answering community questions is really powerful. So that, I would say, is probably the secret weapon. And I would even say, from sort of what I have seen in companies that I've worked with, or that I've just seen in the ecosystem, the value of having a founder answering questions on a Discord or Slack is way higher than having your community manager asking questions or answering questions. Even like if the question is not a particularly interesting question, like just because your community manager is fully capable of answering the question does not mean that the value to your community is the same when it's the community manager versus the founder. I think there's one other thing I want to put out here. Community building is a long game. And if you are not prepared to play a long game, or you don't have the resources to play a long game, probably you shouldn't do it.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. I know you wanted to dig into some of the thoughts of where things are going next. You want to chime in on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess, we've talked about a fair bit about business models and such, state of the union. Many successful companies, especially back from 10 years ago, Mongo, Elastic, all the way now, more recently to HashiCorp, they've changed their licenses, primarily recognizing the challenges that stem from the cloud vendors and the power that they have from the distribution and the platform that they have, which enables them to put out often shoddy but good enough alternatives. So this seems like a challenge that founders will have to contend even in the foreseeable future. So given that, how do you think founders of infra and dev tool companies should think about open source, especially if they're starting out today? Like, what do you think are going to be important for them a few years out from now business imperatives to pursue open source? Anything staying the same? Anything that you think will shift dramatically in the future?
Let me get out my crystal ball and then I'll tell you. I do think, it's a very dynamic ecosystem. So there's some challenges in making predictions. I also think that something that we don't talk about enough is that the business value of the open source project can change over the company's life cycle. So if we think about HashiCorp, at the beginning, having a Terraform open source project helped adoption, right? Now, and everybody could figure out, but it helped with awareness is the word I'm looking for. Sorry. So when you're a tiny company and nobody has ever heard of you, then having an open source company or having an open source project helps with adoption dramatically in some cases and helps with awareness dramatically. Now, once you're a publicly traded company and everybody has heard of you, what's the point? So you really have to think about, and I think one of the problems is that people, they can be sort of open source zealots or purists and think just because we started open source, we have to stay open source. I don't know. This is hard for me because it's the cynic, the ultra capitalist part of me is struggling with the hippie. So I see this from both sides. But I do think if you're building a business and if we're talking about the open source business ecosystem, you just have to acknowledge that the reason for being open source and having an open source project when you are 5 people and the only people who have heard of you is your mom versus a publicly traded company who everyone has heard about, it's a completely different game that you're playing. And this is also why I think you have to be clear throughout about why open source matters to your company. So what's the business value that it's driving? And if you find that it is not driving business value, you have a decision to make. And, quite frankly, the decision that you might have to make, you might have had the decision made for you already. If you've taken venture funding and you find that this open source project really is not driving any value for you, you kind of have to abandon it because that's the deal that you made when you took venture funding, basically. And in fact, I would say that this is why a lot of open source founders who don't take venture funding, because if staying open source is the thing that is most important to you as a founder, and let's face it, everybody who builds a business makes decisions about what kind of business they want to build, right? If you are building an infra tool, you decided that you wanted to build an infra tool, that you did not want to build a consumer application, for example. So you have made a decision about your business. It is okay for people to make decisions to be an open source business or to not be an open source business, to take venture funding or to not take venture funding. But you do have to understand those constraints, right? So a lot of founders that really for them, it's very important that this stays an open source company. They do not take venture funding because they don't want to put themselves in a situation where they're more or less forced to abandon the open source project. And yeah, I think actually, I will say there's other ways to ensure that your project always stays open source. One is to donate it to a foundation. So for example, if HashiCorp had donated some of their projects to a foundation, then we would be having a different conversation about HashiCorp. Would that have been better for their business or not? I have no idea. But, just as a founder, you have to be aware of the trade-offs and the decisions that you're making and go in with eyes open, right? I don't personally think that one is evil or not evil, but I do think people need to be very aware of what choices they're making when it comes to open and understanding what the ramifications are down the line.
You said so many things in just a very fantastic way. It seems it's very clear we are a very dynamic environment. There's no one size fits all, like you said. And then very, very important, that is the role of learnings as being the key underpinnings for any decisions a founder is taking, whether it be when they're starting out or, regardless of the stage of the company. It's very important to keep evaluating whether open source is serving their business goals and what those business goals are. So you very beautifully laid all that out. Thank you, Emily. Finally, you have something really, really interesting brewing on your side, a conference or something like that. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yes, I do. So I'm organizing a conference or summit. It's called Open Source Founders Summit. It is happening May 27th and 28th in Paris. I'm organizing this with Rémi Berthaud, who is the co-founder of Passbolt, which is an open source password manager. And the reason that we're doing this actually is because we thought there was a hole in the conference market, so to speak, that there's no place, no business-focused open source conference that was for open source founders of all types. So there's a lot of talk about open source in the infra world, which is awesome. And I think it makes total sense that there's a lot of open source companies in the infra world, but there are also open source companies that make app layer applications, app layer software, mostly business focused. There's a handful that are consumer focused as well. And there are some challenges that are unique to open source companies, but that all open source companies experience. So that sort of fundamental thing that I talked about, create a project that delivers value, create a commercial offering that delivers value above and beyond. It's really easy to articulate, but it's really hard to do. So we wanted to create a space, a conference that was just focused on that. What are the things that are unique to open source businesses, but all open source businesses experience them? And also a place where you could get a bunch of open source founders together. People can be hopefully relatively honest and open. It's invite only. We're really tightly controlling who's there, precisely so that people can hopefully open up a little bit more, get past the sales, break past the sales mode and be honest about what's working and what isn't in their company. And also there's, a lot of talks, some of which I think are going to be quite awesome, that are very practical. So this is something I see that's lacking in a lot of conferences, quite frankly. And so this is actually, that's the part that I'm micromanaging, is making sure that there's concrete takeaways from every talk. So yeah, if you are the founder of an open source company, you should come in May.
That sounds awesome. Goal is to be open about open source. So we will have a link in the show notes for Emily's website. And Emily, are you planning on having information about the conference on your website?
Good question. To be totally honest, I don't think there's any there right now, and I should probably go fix that. Right now, I'll go update it.
Okay. Well, by the time we
that's a huge oversight. Yeah.
It's okay. We're all learning. Again, thank you so much for making the time today, Emily. This is a fantastic conversation about all things open source. Founders, check out Emily's conference. Hope you can make it to Paris. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Enterprise GTM podcast. Subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts so you'll never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on your favorite podcast platform so we can continue to help enterprise founders thrive.